Francis Weller, sir, welcome to Men This Way.
Glad to be here with you, Bryan. Thanks for inviting me.
Now, I got to tell you, my heart is pounding right now, and as I've been, sitting with the anticipation of this conversation with you, we've been in conversation for the better part of this year about I had to cancel our interview back in May. I think I was going on a trip, and you know, Francis, your work has touched an immensity in me that I think my heart is pounding. I don't get so nervous about meeting my heroes or celebrities or anything. I don't that's not a thing for me. But your work has touched something so immense in me that I I think what's happening for me is it's just like I'm wanting to explore everything with you and dive into everything with you. And I know there's just no way we're going to even we're going to approach something, but to do it justice would take lifetimes, or at least the rest of one of our lifetimes to do it. And I think it's so I want to share that, and I want to say that, and I want my audience to hear it. I want you to hear it because you have medicine. You are a medicine carrier in ways that few of my, certainly the elders and even many of the teachers I've studied, I think, I don't know, not trying to compare, but I just want to say thank you, Francis, for being here.
Mm,
And
I'm very touched by those words, Bryan. I'm glad that the path that I have been called to has found some resonance out there in the world, and I can see by and hear by your words that it's landed in you in a in a
yeah,
in a good way, which is
it,
meaningful for me. I mean,
yeah,
you keep me spiritually employed.
yes, yeah. Thank you. I know that. Yes, yes, I can relate to that very much. And as a 47-year-old man, I'm 47, and it's only in the last 7-8 years, I think, since I approached 40 and entered my 40s, that I started to realize, wait a second, I don't really have elders. I don't know if it's Bill Plotkin, somebody, this makes this distinction between olders and elders. And I realized, within the last 10 years, I don't really have elders. I have a few, and the ones I have they seem to be women that I really look up to as elders, like people showing me the way into the life my soul feels it was born to live through this body. And I think, as a man especially, I look to you, I look at your work, as I've spent much time with you and your offerings over the past, you know it was one of my coaching clients, a man who brought you to me, and one of the greatest gifts I've ever been given.
Mm.
So I see you, I look to you as an elder, and you are a rare commodity, sadly, in my experience. And I think in a lot of our listeners, men and women, I think they'll be able to relate to that as well. So it's a privilege to sit here with you today.
Thank you.
And I want to start. There's a starting point for our conversation, and we've already begun. And I know that I'm talking a lot, and I want to shut up and let you talk because, but also, it's crazy. Like as a younger, feeling unseen by the elders, here I am sitting with an elder. There's that part of me that's like, see me, guide me, help me. Like that's part of the pounding in my chest as a man in his mid 40s, longing for the elder man, particularly, to say, look at the name of my podcast, Men This Way. Um, let me start here, because you said something that I've often remarked as a coach myself, and I've worked with couples for many years, and men and women now. And you said men don't show up voluntarily; they show up because they have been defeated.
Yes.
And I think you were sharing this in the context of who shows up in your therapy office
Yes.
primarily. And I sat with that, and I've reflected on this even myself. Like, I'm a man who's been on some level committed to personal growth work for decades. I've done all the transformational workshops. I've done, psychedelics for the purpose of awareness and insight. I have a master's degree in human relations. Like, I've studied with teachers. Like, I've done all this stuff, and yet I'm aware that the times in my life when I really showed up, Francis, were the times when indeed something in life had fully defeated me,
Mm-hmm.
and I could no longer just rely on book knowledge, or a
Right.
smart intellect. So I'm
Right.
curious, why do you suppose, so two questions in this, why do you suppose it takes that for us men to be defeated before we really show up, like to hit some bottom? And I'm really interested to know about you personally as a man, a time in your life when you were finally fully defeated and that called you to then really show up in a new way.
Hmm. Okay, the first part, all of the striving we do to improve, to get better, to be more spiritual, more awake, more, aware, those are all good pursuits, but they oftentimes get kind of tangled up with a heroic pursuit, somehow making ourselves better. Oftentimes means I leave behind huge parts of me, the weakness, the inadequacy, the shame, the lonely one, all the inferior brothers, the outcast brothers. And there's no real arrival into soul without them.
Mm,
There's an arrival into self-improvement,
mhm,
self-mastery. So we have to make a little distinction between self and soul.
mm,
Self is the presentation of my identity to the world. Soul is what animates that identity. But if I'm so busy improving the self, oftentimes I neglect the soul. And
mm,
soul takes us into the vulnerable, into grief, into loss, into our own tender
mm,
ground. And that's why defeat comes along periodically and throws us to the ground, into the depths,
mhm,
into confusion, into bewilderment, into shame. We are thrown into that territory, not out of some, what would you call it, sadistic sense, but out of a necessity to weave that part into our being. Because,
mm,
like I say, there was no arrival. There's no even real true sense of belonging until the whole house comes with me. Not just the ideal parts, not just the successful, competent brothers,
mm,
but also all of the weak ones, all of the ones that drool and
mm.
don't know how to dress properly, and
Yeah.
the ones we want to keep a little hidden because we are a heroic culture,
Mhm.
and that imagery demands that we always show strength.
Yeah.
So we only get to show part of ourselves. And if that's the case, no man's going to walk into my office
Mhm. Yeah.
because that's the image of strength.
Yeah.
But unless there's been a depression, an addiction, a divorce, loss of a job, an illness, death of someone close,
Yeah.
that's when they crawl in the door. That's when they've been brought to the ground. And if we're lucky, we remain there. We,
Yeah.
we remain close to the ground. Humus, humility, not heroics, but humility is what binds us together.
Mm.
It makes us recognize the commonality that we all share. The heroic distinguishes us. The humility entangles us
Yeah.
with one another.
I, the you talk a lot about this heroic culture, and I think I first heard you I use that term to identify that, and that really spoke to me, especially in these last many years, as I've been, okay, I'm a white man, 47 years old. I'm a white man. I've pretty much gotten everything that this culture says is coming to me.
Mm-hmm.
I got the woman, I got the work, I'm making money, I'm successful, I have admiration, I have, just I'm not in the 0.1%, but I'm probably in the 1%. And holy shit, Francis, all of a sudden, uh, what now? Sort of happened to me in the last, 3, 4 years. Like, oh my God,
Mm-hmm.
I don't, what now? And, I think your work came to me. Look, I wish it would have come to me 25 years ago, but here we are. And, around, because grieving, you talk about the heroic culture and what arises for me inside of that, being defeated. Well, I got everything I wanted, more or less. I mean, I've been defeated in many ways over the years, and some, usually at the hands of a woman or a relationship anyway, or running out of money at different times, whatever. But nothing major happened. Nobody died. In my case, I wasn't sexually abused or assaulted or, just, and so a part of me's been thinking, well, what do I have to grieve? What do I have to, why should I hurt? So my parents divorced at 4. So what? Um, no one beat me. So I grew up with alcoholism in my home at a young age. So what? I mean, I wasn't beaten. Nobody talked bad to me. And yet, Francis, in these last few years, I'm uncovering a mountain of grief and sadness and loss. And the heroic culture you speak of, there's no place for that.
No. No.
You said something also. There are 2 illnesses in our modern world: amnesia and anesthesia. I think a lot of our listeners will be able to relate to anesthesia in a sense, the numbing out using, whether it's money, work, porn, video games, sex, TV, whatever, gambling, alcohol. What have we forgotten? What's the amnesia part of that? I know there's something. I feel it. I know it. You speak to it. What do you say about that?
I guess before we move too far into
Sure,
that,
sure.
I want to just acknowledge your other question about my own defeat.
Ah, yes. Thank you
And,
for calling
and
back to that. Yes.
yeah, it was the time when the one that's coming to my mind, there's been multiple defeats as
Yeah.
well, but I had, I think, just turned 40 and everything was
Mm,
good, just like you were describing. I had a family, I had a young son, I was house on the hill. Everything was beautiful, and I was dying inside.
mm,
There was
mhm, mm,
a slow suffocation that was happening inside me, a depression that was borderline suicidal. And the defeat saved my life because it was the only point at which I was finally able to say, I need help. And that's when I surrendered and asked 3 men to do a ritual for me,
mhm,
to help me get out of this grave that I was digging every day.
mm,
And that defeat, like the men who come into my office or come to the retreats and or do the initiation work, that defeat, if we're really candid about it, is the invitation towards some sense of connectivity again, out of that isolation. The heroic is a very isolated archetype.
mm,
It's a singular presence.
mm,
You're above everything else.
mm,
You need no one.
mm,
The hero is basically independent and autonomous. It's the other parts of us that recognize how much I need other people. When I did redefine weakness for men, that I said weakness only says that the next step I take, I cannot take alone. That's all it
mm,
says. It's
mm,
not a commentary.
mm,
It's not a commentary on your inadequacy or your worthlessness. It just says the next step requires
mm,
support.
mm.
But that's a shameful thing for a man to admit. So that's one of my personal moments of defeat.
And I've heard you tell this story, and I love this story. What did those 3 friends do?
They took me into a ritual process that radically shook my world. Yesterday was the anniversary of that, 25 years ago.
Mm.
Um, they put me through an ordeal that part of the strategic mode of getting by in this culture is to pretend you always know what the fuck is going on.
Yeah.
And they put me through a ritual where I couldn't pretend it anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I tried to figure out what they wanted from me
Mm.
in the ritual, like, well, they want me to fight or they want me to,
Uh-huh.
and then, and of course, those are empty gestures kind of conjured by my mind. But what I had to do is completely let go of all of that. And in my language, I had to become deranged.
Yeah.
I had to let go of control.
Mm.
And something in that moment, some radical uh, transmission between this world and the other world occurred. And I saw exactly what I needed to do in that moment and what I needed to do in terms of fighting for my life for the first time. See, I was a great accommodator. I knew what people wanted from me, and I was very good at giving
Mm-hmm.
people what they wanted. And that was my provisional sense of belonging.
Yeah.
But my depression was about never feeling like I belonged. I could pretend like I did. I could give you what I thought would please you, then you would like me and approve of me. But it's not the belonging.
Yeah.
That's strategic manipulation. So I had to somehow break through that fiction and come into something much more authentic, much more real. And that moment, I consider that like December 2nd,
Mm.
threshold moment between the first 40 years and the last 25 years are so radically different
Mm.
in terms of my presence.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that you were acknowledging before came out of that
Yeah.
stepping into my life for the first time,
Yeah.
and occupying what soul was yearning to express, but never having a conduit for it because I was so preoccupied with fooling everybody.
I find it, um, and we'll come back to my other questions in a moment about amnesia and anesthesia, but I'm particularly struck by the format, you could say, of that, or the container of that experience. Three of your male friends created an ordeal for you.
Yeah.
Um, one of the things that no one ever really told me and that I didn't trust. I'm a former military guy, 10 years in the Air Force. Was a captain in the Air Force, and I was in a fraternity in college. I'm no stranger to men throughout most of my life. But what I found also is that I didn't trust men.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't trust them. I didn't feel safe around men, certainly not to be vulnerable. And yet, now, later in my life, I find that I can't thrive. I can't really feel deeply good about my life unless I have solid, trustable men around me regularly. And when I'm doing, men's work, one way we call it. So I'm just struck. I'm just struck by that in your storytelling, in your experience, that it was your male friends putting you through an ordeal that was
Mm-hmm.
difficult and challenging and left you no out except I don't even know how the language to use, but through, or surrender, or letting go, or being deranged, as you say,
Yeah. Yeah.
to upend the previous arrangement.
Yeah. And then that takes a great deal of trust.
Yeah.
It also takes a great deal of familiarity. I had to be known that thoroughly
Mm,
on some level by these men
mm,
to
mm-hmm.
precisely design something. It wasn't cookie cutter. It wasn't, well, let's, whatever, but it
Yeah.
had to have the precision. Even the language that was spoken during that ritual
Mm,
landed so squarely at the heart of the trouble. But there was nothing I could do to evade,
Mm,
duck, to deny, to
mm,
um, the only, like as we say, the only way out was through. And I'd still be on that hillside today if I hadn't.
mm.
You were not going to let me go.
Mhm.
And it was a 7 hour ordeal, and I was wrecked by the end of it.
Yeah.
Something shifted so profoundly inside of me of what I needed to, how I needed to kind of structure my life and to carry myself into the world. And you know,
I, I'm struck by something that one of your friends said, Maladoma Some. Did I pronounce his name right?
yes, mm-hmm.
I think I read about this in Bill Plotkin's book, Nature and the Human Soul, about the initiation rites of passage that Maladoma Some, in his culture, he spoke to, their boys undergo an ordeal similarly. And it could be that sometimes they don't survive,
Right.
but that in their culture they feel it. I don't know if this is the right language, but it's better that a boy not survive that ordeal than he live into adulthood without ever having undergone the ordeal. To be I can't remember the exact language he used there, but I was again really struck by that and how you're saying like your friends. I know we're speaking a bit poetically, but would have left you on that hillside had you not been
Mm-hmm.
able
Yeah.
to make that
Yeah.
crossover.
Yeah. Well, Maladoma was one of those men that was there that day.
Oh, I love that. Oh man, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. Three men who knew ritual
Ah,
so
yes.
deeply in their bones that. um,
Ah.
But this ties us back into the amnesia piece.
Well, and he might have left you, so you're right. They might have left
Yeah,
you there.
yeah.
Because
They were
wow.
definitely not going to rescue me.
I love it. Okay, thank you. That's
But
what I love.
this ties us into the amnesia in the sense of
Mhm.
uh, having spent some time in his culture. You see the consequence of a local culture that still remembers to some degree what's required to shape an adult human being. And when we forget that, when we abandon those practices, we end up with a collective of adolescents that
Mhm.
are self centered, self interested, but not communally interested. See, initiation in the traditional sense was never meant for the individual.
Mm.
No, it was not about my personal growth.
Mm.
It wasn't about making me a better person,
Yeah.
more admirable.
Mm.
It was an act of sacrifice on behalf of the community to which now the initiate is committed and is devoted. It
Mm.
was an act for the other, it was an act for the community. Now, that's such a strange thought for us because
Yeah.
everything's always about me. I go to therapy for me. I do spiritual workshops for me. But in the traditional sense, initiation uh, was for the community. It was for the commons. It was for the watershed. It was for the cosmos. But it was not about you. And we have that completely twisted around. This is part of the amnesia.
Yeah.
When you forget the structures that create living culture,
Mm.
you're reduced to mimics of it. So we have personal growth rather than initiation.
Mhm.
There's similar territory,
Right.
but the outcome is so radically different.
Yes.
They almost separate, in the long run. Go ahead.
Well, I'm smiling and laughing because there's something, my childhood bestie. I'm so blessed that I get to my childhood best friend. We've been friends for 37 years. He and I a year ago, and we started facilitating men's work together, and we've created this this year long men's initiation program called we call it Elevate 2021. This year we're now in Elevate 2022, and for 12 men. And one of the things that he'll often in his when he's talking to men who have applied and want to be a part of this, um, he's a passionate man. He is a beautiful, beautiful man. I mean, he's one of the finest people I know on the planet. His name's Tate, and he'll often tell them, "You need to know that this is not about you. you joining this program, this experience, this is not about you. We'll often presence, for whom does it matter that you're here in our work. And we'll say this is not, and it's funny because I'll Tate will tell me about these conversations, and I'll be like, Tate, you can't necessarily just say that. You have to tell them it is also for them. So I'm kind of laughing because there's that, our culture, like, I think on some level these guys need to think that it is about them, but also it's not about them. To the point I think that, like, that feels like soul language.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's no doubt that the process uh, radically changes them.
Yeah.
I mean, the goal of initiation, if we can put that language on it, which is very,
I know.
but if there's an intention behind initiation, part of it is to crack the identity open so that I am now part of the watershed. I am part willow and part turtle and part sky and part lichen. I become part of all that, and that's the intention. So that when something is happening to the watershed, it's felt in my bones.
Mm-hmm.
It quickens me to respond to protection, towards service, rather than, again, my own internal world, which is beautiful. I love the work of the internal world, but what about the affiliation to the larger world?
I see it, even in the language we use to describe this, elevate
I
2022.
was going to say something about that.
Well, I see it, elevate.
Yeah.
Well, I think in your, I've gone through a part of I'm still working on your Alchemy of Initiation course that you hosted recently, which, again, just a revelation. And I know that you led a year-long journey for men for 17 years.
Yes.
And you shared that for the first half of your journey was really a descent of sorts, an underworld's journey.
Yeah.
I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that. How you helped steward men through the course of a year. What, because there's not a lot of things out there that I've ever been certainly part of or even seen that really do that, hold men for a year. And I'm doing it now, and I'm learning so much. I mean, I have as much to learn as I have to teach. And I have more to learn than I have to teach. And that's been part of my paralysis myself of doing men's work, is without elders showing me the way. Like, where the hell am I leading men? Has been a persistent, paralyzing question. Where the hell am I taking guys? I don't even know where I'm going. Where are we going? So, I see elevate. I see it. Well, again, where are we going? So that it's a heroic term.
Yes.
And I see that.
Yeah. Well, good. I mean, that's really important to see how much it's always about rising.
Yeah.
I mean, that's that heroic archetype right there. It's always about rising.
Yeah.
There's nothing wrong with that. Okay. Yeah. It's a beautiful thing to grow and to get stronger. It's beautiful, but it leaves so much out.
Yeah.
So the first part of the initiation process was about shedding. We call our work the making of ordinary men.
That's beautiful.
Because we're so conditioned to try to be special. And that specialness comes out of a fractured sense of belonging. So if I don't belong, then I better impress the hell out of you.
Yeah.
So I have to be something more than. And I often talk about this image as like watching a falcon fly. God, they're beautiful, aren't they? But not a single falcon up there is trying to be a special falcon. They are just being themselves.
Yeah.
And when a creature is just itself, it is most beautiful. And when we're trying to be special, there is no exchange. The flow all comes towards me, and I offer nothing. So part of becoming an ordinary man is to get back into the exchange. Come back into the conversation with the living world. Yes, I have gifts to give, and yes, I am in need of gifts, and But that exchange has to occur out of a mutuality. And so that making of ordinary men is part of that thinning out and shedding, letting go. I remember we were up in Oregon doing a year long with a group up there. And on the first night, we're sitting out under the moon, and I use that language, our work here is to make ordinary men of you. And a man, almost like he had springs in his butt, leapt off the ground and started screaming at me. I've spent my whole life
Mhm.
trying to become special, and you're going to take that away from me?
Mm.
That's how desperately we cling to
Yeah.
these identities, and it's scary to let them go. Who will I
Yes.
be without that special identity of a perfect? I mean, in graduate school, I was called the golden boy. That was my nickname.
Mm.
I was so polished and
Mm.
shining, but inside it was so dead,
Mm.
cold. So
Yeah.
the first half of the year, we work in the underworld.
Yeah.
The first weekend, we work with what we call the predator and grief.
Mm-hmm.
So we go into this territory of uh, what is the main adversary that we really have to confront? What is this energy of death that we've made agreements with over and over again? To live small, to be good and nice boys, but never to find our authority and our presence in the world. We could spend several days unpacking this idea
Yeah.
of predator.
I know.
And then after you unpack that one and you see all the collusions and the ways in which you've lived partial lives, kind of backing your way into the grave without ever really arriving here, there's tremendous grief. So that first week that we're together, we do a confrontation with predator, which is what that ritual those men did for me.
Mm.
That's what I saw in that
Okay.
ritual.
Yeah.
That I was in collusion with the energies of death,
Mm.
and I was dying every day.
Mm-hmm.
So we do a ritual that's really powerful, which I cannot describe to you. Uh, and then after that, we move into grief work, and the amount of grief that the men begin to share around having lived these provisional lives, trying to figure out what people expected from them. How do I fit in? How do I convince you to let me in? Another part of our amnesia, right? I mean, I was talking to Maladoma, and he was saying, in our village, it's the job of the community, of the village, to impress into the body of every child that they are somebody worthy of belonging and that they're carriers of gift.
Mm-hmm.
I said, yes, in our culture, we've turned that 180 degrees
Mm.
around, where it's up to me to convince you that I'm someone worthy of being tolerated.
Mm.
And we
Yeah.
spend a lifetime, again, this is our adolescent pursuit, a lifetime trying to find the ways that we can manage exile or belonging.
Yeah.
And always living on that very thin edge between those two realities. So this is again part of what happens when we fall into amnesia and we forget these principles of living culture.
Well, I mean, I'm just lit up, and I mean, the follicles on my skin are on edge because I'm men, there's this pursuit of freedom, constantly freedom, more money, more status, more respect, more whatever, more likes, more admiration, to be special, to be special. There's no freedom in that. That is the ultimate entrapment.
Yes.
And as I'm hearing you describe, the making of ordinary men, oh, what a release. What a fucking relief. I don't have to be special. Oh, I can just be.
Yes.
What? That's the fucking freedom that we're
Yes.
all ironically looking for through our social media status or our bank accounts or whatever. And it's in the make. I'm just, again, feeling in a visceral level, what you speak and the way that you speak it and articulate it. And, um, my heart breaks. This is again,
Yeah.
my heart breaks.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the things we have to really acknowledge, particularly men in general, is the emptiness that we feel inside. Why do we pursue all those things you just mentioned?
Mm,
Status, rank,
mm,
wealth, privilege, Dominance. Why do we pursue those things? Well, because there's a quality of emptiness that we feel inside
Mm-hmm.
that is rooted in individualism and the absence of community.
Mm.
Individualism is a breeding ground for a feeling of emptiness.
Mm.
And we are addicted to individualism. Again, another aspect of that heroic template is you shall always be sovereign. You shall always be alone. You shall need no one. And so, in the absence of what we really crave, which is community, sharing ritual together, grieving together, saying thank you together, dancing together, singing together, sharing meals together, dreams, stories. Those are the things that we really long for. It isn't about what's on TV tonight
Yeah.
or the latest cell phone. What we crave are what I call the primary satisfactions, the things that shaped us over hundreds of thousands of years. And this is where that amnesia really reaches its pinnacle. We've
Yeah.
lost the primary satisfactions, and we are a culture addicted to the secondary satisfactions. That's why we are the highest consuming culture on the planet. We make up, what, 5% of the population, something like that? Can't remember, but we consume almost 25% of the goods of the world.
Mm.
What is wrong?
Yeah.
And you can never get enough of what you don't need.
Yeah.
And that is not the very essence of addiction, right? You want more and more and more. So we have millionaires and billionaires craving more. Like they don't have enough. But there can never be enough if you're not addressing the core issue, which is this emptiness. I was in a racism workshop some years back in Berkeley, and we were going around the circle introducing ourselves. And just by the circle, I was the last one to share. And when it was my turn, I said, I'm one of the things I'm really looking at is this question of emptiness. And a black man literally jumped out of his chair and pointed at me and said, "That's it. Until your people address this issue, you'll continue to kill from us and steal from us every fucking day."
Mm.
And it just was like this,
Mm.
okay, I get it. That is my spiritual responsibility, is to dig into this hole, weep into this hole,
Mm-hmm.
and help other people understand that they're living in this hole that can never be filled by things. The opposite of emptiness is not fullness. It is presence. It's entanglement. It's embodiment. That's the opposite of emptiness.
Mm.
It's not more. It's engagement, That's what the initiation is really about. So that first half a year is really about kind of cracking open the conditioned shell of a man's psyche, according to Western civilization, white Western civilization,
Yeah.
and kind of unmasking that and seeing the cost of that.
Yeah.
And then we dive deep into the quality and character of their wounds. And through that lens of the wound, they begin to catch a glint of what their medicine might look like. And then we work with love and power. How do those two dynamics exchange with one another, fulfill each other,
Mm-hmm.
rather than choosing one or the other? A lot of us are nice boys, so we think we choose love. And then Jung would say that our power then goes into the shadow.
Mm.
Or conversely, we choose power, and then he said, then our love goes into the shadow. But we need both.
Yeah.
We need power that's infused with love, and we need love that's potent, that has vitality behind it. Love has to become not maudlin, but robust, to love our world, our children, or the generations to come. That requires a love that isn't, saccharine or sentimentalized.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like to say far less eloquently that um, it's not about choosing between heart or brains and balls. It's about connecting our heart to our brains and our balls.
Yeah.
And I would really like to explore grieving with you because that's what brought me to you. Your book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow.
Mm.
And it's related to what it's from what we're just exploring right now. I mean, the heartbreak that I experience regularly when I look into the world and see what we're doing. Right? I think you or someone you quoted, or someone, I don't remember where I get so many of my references these days. But participating in this culture requires destroying the planet. To just participate, I have to destroy the planet. My heart breaks every day when I look out. I have a beautiful view in my home here in Los Angeles, and I look out, and what I see hurts me every day. Um, it speaks to the amnesia and the anesthesia.
Yeah.
And um, your book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, Francis, and to all my listeners, it's one of the most beautiful books I've ever read. It's not a long book. It's not complicated, but it's gorgeous. It's
Mm.
beautiful. It's it's profound, and I find, just as an aside, I find that the teachers that really do what we might call soul centered work, therapeutic work, whatever, soul infused work, use a lot of poetry. You're quoting Rilke a lot, Joanna Macy and Mary Oliver and different, John O'Donohue, um, and so your book, which again was gifted to me by a client that I was working with, a man who's going through a breakup, um, just went off like a bomb inside of me in the most beautiful way,
Mm.
because it connected to something that I was already waking up to, that there's so much grieving undone inside of me. And so, a few of the things I just want to sort of list that really opened up for me, and I have some questions around this. Um, that our grieving was never meant to be so private. Holy shit. Why is that so obvious? But yet it never occurred to me.
Well, how could it? I mean,
Yeah.
if the context is heroic, then it's has to be
Mm.
private,
Yeah.
because grief is one of those things that reveals the heart.
Mm.
And one of the primary, principles of heroic lifestyle is keep the heart protected.
Yeah.
So we can't grieve publicly. We can't
Mm.
grieve in the open. I mean, that's one of the most beautiful things that happens in the initiation work and also on the retreats that I do, is to see men holding each other
Mm-hmm.
as they're grieving. It's so profoundly,
Mm.
reparative to this incredible isolation that we've been
Mm.
confined to, this solitary confinement. To come out of that into each other's arms and weep, it's it's precious.
Also, that grief, unmetabolized, or I don't know, unacknowledged, unseen, unworked with, becomes bitter.
Yes.
That
Yeah.
landed. That really landed for me.
Yeah, you can feel it. I mean, you can
Mm.
see it, manifested. I mean, when people come to see me in my office, they often come in with this self-diagnostic process of depression.
Mm.
And what I often say to them is, sounds more like oppression.
Mm.
That there are layers and layers of sediment that have come into your life from untouched sorrow, untouched grief. And you can begin to feel how it begins to taint the sweetness of life into something bitter, where you begin to reject life and to pull away from life. And that's why we want to do the work of grieving, is because it's the way in which the heart is once again quickened and softened and opened. Um, Part of why it's so hard to be a human being right now is that there's so much coming into the heart
Mm.
that is griefful. That there's so much sorrow, and we're not wired. We're not designed to digest this much loss and grief on a day by day basis. So if we don't have a practice
Mm-hmm.
to keep that material moving, then you have to shut down.
Yeah.
So all praise for numbness, all praise for anesthesia. It helps us to endure, but it certainly doesn't help us to stay engaged.
And I've chosen, as I think many men will. I've chosen a partner, in my case, a woman, an intimate, my wife, who feels deeply, cries regularly.
Yes.
She does it as a practice. She knows she needs to,
Yes.
and yet my nervous system is not so open as that. I might say I'm in the work. I'm working on it, doing the things that I need, that I think I will be helpful. I'm still working on that, and yet I know that in my calcifying around grief, my wife doesn't get all of me in many ways. She doesn't get to feel a lot of me, and that doesn't serve
Mhm.
us.
No, but that's very well said. And I appreciate your honesty about that. I mean, I think we have to have a tremendous amount of self compassion for where we are.
Mm,
I wrote in my book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow, that grief work is what opens the heart to compassion for the suffering of others. But I didn't write in there is that it requires self compassion to open to our own grief.
mhm,
So we have to actually bring enough kindness and warmth. See, when grief is not metabolized, it turns cold. It's an old alchemical idea that you have to keep the material warm for it to move.
mm,
And when we neglect our grief, when we turn away from it, when we don't trust it, when we're fearful of it, those are all cold states. And so then the grief congeals and hardens, and we can feel it in our heart. When the heart becomes, well, why is congestive heart failure the number one cause of death? Well, it isn't just,
mm.
French fries. It's also the fact that we have forgotten how to keep the heart emptied, open, flowing. So we have to have a great deal of compassion that this is where we start. And it isn't about pushing through the grief. It isn't about forcing it. It's about softening to the grief.
Mm,
That's what I call taking up the apprenticeship with sorrow.
mm.
Is how do I come into a lifelong companionship that I'll never be free of grief, ever.
Yeah.
But I'd also, what I want is to have an ongoing living friendship with grief, as if it's the companion walking alongside me every day, which puts me then in terms of the bittersweet.
Mm,
That's the full measure.
mm,
If I deny grief, I turn bitter. If I can companion grief, I can remember the bittersweet,
mm,
which is a deepening and a ripening. And I think that's what leads to elderhood in the long run.
mm,
There's someone who is not afraid to keep digesting the material of the world, the losses and tragedies and traumas of the world, because that person can simultaneously see the sweetness, the beauty, the exquisite elegance of this world is not lost on someone who has done that work.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you quote a Rilke. I mean uh, the depths of it. That you quote Rilke in your book. Be ahead of all parting, as if it has already happened.
Yeah.
And I remember an experience when I was probably 20 years old. It was my last year of college in Arizona, and I was sitting on top this rock with my girlfriend in college. And I remember distinctly realizing it's probably the first time I was consciously aware that this moment is going to end. This is going to come and go in a blink of an eye. So better kind of lock it in. I remember feeling the wind on my skin, feeling,
Mhm.
I mean, it's so visceral even now because I was so aware of the moments passing, but what I'm also aware of, and that's something that I've held with me throughout the years, that even before our conversation, for instance, there was a moment I was feeling I was grieving and I was sad. Because I've been so excited for this, and I'm like, okay, we're gonna have this moment, and then this is gonna pass, and there was a heartbreak in that. I think, but in the past, and even perhaps now, there's a part of me that still just wants to bypass that grief. Yeah, 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 yeah. Life goes on. Suck
At,
it up.
at what cost, Bryan?
My vitality. But yeah, what I don't, I'm sure I don't even really know the full answer to that question.
Yeah. To bypass the grief is what keeps the heart congested.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember I was driving back from a men's retreat once with a friend of mine, and he just kind of quipped to me, "So, Francis, are you happy?" And I said, "I have moments of being happy, but I also have moments of being sad and lonely and angry and, heartbroken." And I said, "I've stopped trying to be happy because I realized every time I didn't make it, I thought I was failing
Mm.
because we're a happiness culture."
Yeah.
I said, "But what I want is to be alive."
Yeah.
And every one of those feelings has vitality in them.
Mm.
When I'm in my grief, I am fully alive. Grief, it cannot be domesticated. It is a wild creature. And you cannot. The only thing you can do is try to avoid it. And that's that state that you just described, trying to bypass the grief. But that means my own aliveness, my own vitality, as you say, will be compromised. And I will become smaller.
Yeah.
The circumference of my life will continue to diminish. That's where I was when I was 40 years old,
Mm-hmm.
refusing to enter into the messiness of those things.
Yeah.
Grief is always there.
I just want to check in with you about time. Are you okay if we go another 20 minutes or so?
Let's do that.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Something else that also was just a revelation for me was that grief needs to properly or genuinely grieve, we need containment and release.
Yes.
This again blew up in me, Francis, because I realized, and you said this, you can't release your grief. It's not an exact, I'm paraphrasing, but you can't release grief if you're also being the container for it. I have been the container for my own grief forever.
Right.
Even as a child, the things that were happening to me, nobody ever really, except, maybe a cousin died. And okay, so my dad held me and let me cry that out. But that's kind of it. All the other things I was going through that were happening, experiencing, nobody held a container for that. And so I conditioned, my body became conditioned to be its own container. No fucking wonder.
No.
To this day, it's a challenge for me to just let myself cry during a movie.
Yeah, those two requirements. Again, if we go back to the heroic model, and you're not allowed to ask for that support,
Mm-hmm.
you become what I call a continuous. You recycle grief over and over again. You're just chewing the same bones. The same pieces are just tumbling through there over and over again, and there's no release. Because in order for release to occur, you have to be held and do one job, which is to be the one doing the work. That's why you don't see in traditional cultures solitary grief work. It's always communal. Now, I can't tell you how many times after a grief ritual is over, we spend usually 3 or 4 days together. At the end of it, someone will speak up and say, I've never done anything like this before. This was so beyond anything I've ever done. But then they'll say something like, but it felt oddly familiar. Mm-hmm. And that's the deep memory echo. That's beyond the amnesia.
Yeah.
There's a thing Jung said, we have an unforgotten wisdom at the core of the psyche. So in the unforgotten wisdom, we remember this. That's why when we're in that space, the psyche perks up, soul perks up and goes, that's what I've been waiting for. This is it. Mm-hmm. I've been waiting to be in circle and singing and kneeling side by side and having the shrine and everyone kind of collaboratively entering into the well of sorrow together. And my God, does the grief flow then. Yeah, but I also just say, in all honesty, and I think I've said this before in other contexts, that it took me 3 grief rituals before I shed my first tear. Mm. I was a very well-packed white man, in control, in control. And I thought the third time was going to be the same story. But then someone I knew and trusted came along and put their hand on my shoulder And I looked at them and I saw something in their eyes, and then I was on the floor for 3 hours. And
Yeah.
then that well finally broke open, or that dam finally broke. Now tears are a very frequent guest in my house. You know,
In my last the men's retreat I did for my Elevate 2021 group back in August, we did 5 days together, and we'd been working with each other for already 7, 8 months by this time. And me and my partner Tate, we're holding the container for that experience. We're the facilitators, we're the container holders for these 10 men. And I remember at the end, the very last day, we do all the stuff we do. And at the end, the men want to honor Tate and I. They want to put us in the middle of the circle and put their hands on us and speak into us. And I remember in that moment, there was no why for it. All of a sudden, my body just burst into tears, sobbing, the shoulders and the whole body just, something about just in that moment being held by these men.
yeah.
So I've asked my friends, a men's group that I've been in for a few years, where we're all in it together. I'm not facilitating it; no one's facilitating it. It's just our men's group. I've asked them all just in the last few weeks. I said, guys, I I want to start doing monthly, and I'm hesitant to use the word, but grieving circles. And I'm hesitant to use the word only because I have that story that, well, the only people who are going to show up are the people who believe they have something to grieve. Something big happened, a death or a breakup, something obvious. And I'm realizing that there's so much to grieve. It's more like I want to just talk about loss. And you've shared this in some of your how do you get started doing this? I want to start leading these at least monthly circles where we just talk about loss and sorrow. How do you, how would you suggest I start a conversation like that and by the way, even the fumbly way I've done it, all my friends are in. They all get it. We all know. I mean, we talk about this. This is a real good group of men. We know, we see, just no one's brought that up yet. And I'm bringing it up. And so they're in.
Well,
Um,
thank you for doing that. I mean, I think most of us are just waiting for permission.
yeah.
I think there's such a prohibition against entering into that room. There's also a fear of entering that room.
Definitely.
But one of the things, before you get too far into it, is talk about fear. Talk about, why are we so hesitant to open this door?
Mm-hmm.
And like you said before, many of us did not have our grief held when we were young.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't feel like there's a bottom to it. So when we get into that territory, we feel like we're in free fall.
Yeah.
But part of why it's so valuable to do this in a group context is we begin to have faith in grief again, that it's not there to take me hostage. It's actually there to ripen me and make my heart more elastic and capable of holding not only my grief, but your grief and the children's grief and the salmon's grief and, that the complexity of grief. And then I think it's good to talk about the 5 gates.
Yeah.
Because we do only think of grief primarily in terms of losing someone we love or a marriage ending, or people will then say, I'm really sorry about your loss. But the other 4 gates, about personal losses to our integrity, pieces of me that have to go into hiding, and, my shame, my feelings of worthlessness, my weakness, all those outcast brothers, I call them. That's a loss. That's a loss to my wholeness. And every loss is worthy of grieving, but I can't grieve them because I hold them with contempt. So part of the grief work, oftentimes in that second gate, and that's what therapy is about, is kind of bringing in the outcasts in a way that we can grieve their absence sometimes for a lifetime. And then we talk about the third gate, which is the sorrows of the world. And who doesn't know the sorrows of the world right now?
Yeah.
As you say, you look out your window into LA and you're looking into the belly of the sorrow.
Mm.
Whether it's the quality of the air or
Mm-hmm.
the homeless or the
Mm-hmm.
rapacious consumption or
Mm-hmm.
the silencing of languages, the abuse
Yeah.
to people of color. I mean, there's so much sorrow in the world. And part of our work is to come out of the fantasy that I'm separate from that.
Yeah.
We feel it in our tissue every day.
Mm.
And so we need places to talk about that. And then the fourth gate is what we expected and did not receive. This is the amnesia piece,
Mm-hmm.
that we're wired for the entire spectrum of experiences that our deep time ancestors had, of village life, of tribal life. And I mean, that's in our DNA,
Yeah.
both physiologically, but also psychologically, I think spiritually as well, that we expected to see 40 pairs of eyes looking back at us and seeing us and welcoming us and having belonging just kind of rooted in the bone, so that
Yes.
I'm not anxious about that for the rest of my life. And then the last gate I call the ancestral grief, which has so much complexity to it as I sit with that
Mm.
one. The more I sit with that gate, the more I realize I think all grief is ancestral grief,
Mm.
in the sense that, yes, if I have a wound around shame, which is my wound, well, where did that come from?
Mm.
Why did my family, in some ways, activate that wound if they themselves did not also know that wound? And how many generations back can I go to where the silencing of affection, uh, demonstrations of love got nullified?
Mm.
How many generations back can I go? I can go back pretty many, you know, when that
Mm-hmm.
wound began, or the lingering issues that we hold collectively around what happened to the native cultures when
Mm-hmm.
white European people arrived here, and then the importation of slavery. And we have still not even begun to scratch that grief
Yeah.
collectively. So we're haunted by that unmetabolized sorrow. We are haunted by it every day through racial
Yes.
killings and economic injustices. I mean, that it is a lingering grief. So when someone says I don't have much to grieve,
Yeah.
bullshit. You have too much to grieve.
I remember when Obama was elected, I I was surprised to see. I mean, I voted for him. I was excited. I hoped he would win, but and when he won, I remember I felt lighter in a way that no other election is at. Well, that's maybe the last one a little bit, but um, so and yet, boy, that's gone away.
Yeah. Yeah, we see the backlash. I mean, we're entering a period, what I call the long dark,
Mm-hmm.
which will be decades and decades, perhaps generations, multiple generations, where we are not going to see a whole lot of rising. We are in a time of deep descent in both senses of that word. A lot of dissent is happening right now. A lot of no is being spoken, but we're also in a trajectory downward.
Mm.
And this is a necessary descent, because in the old alchemical language, this is the period of the negredo, the blackening. And in the blackening, that is the beginning process of shedding old structures, old paradigms, old ideologies, old things that do not sustain life. So we have to look at systemic racism and economic injustice, and we have to look at what's happening to our ecological systems. That's such a cold term. To look at what's happening to grizzly bears and
Mm.
glaciers, and
Mm-hmm.
the fact that here in California we have almost no water left.
Mm.
This is not something abstract.
Yeah.
This is immediate and in our flesh and in our bones.
Yeah.
So this is right now. We have to deal with this now. And this is the long dark. This is going to take a long, long period. I just wrote the preface for a new book that's coming out by Dwayne Elgin called Choosing Earth.
Oh, great.
It was the most difficult piece I've ever had to write after reading his book and looking at what's coming in the 2030s, 2040s, 2050s, and beyond. It is scary. And we don't know if we're going to make it. But this planetary initiation, if we can make it, may offer something to those generations, perhaps not even born yet, that might begin to resemble what living culture looks like again.
Mm-hmm.
If we do the work now, we are planting. I often say, I'm not going to see that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to see that.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just about 66 years old. I'm not going to
Mm-hmm.
see that sunrise,
Yeah.
but I can plant seeds now in the dark that when there is enough moisture and enough light, those seeds might emerge into something that can sustain life again. That's my job. That's your job. That's every man who listens to this podcast job. It isn't about my future, my benefit, but it's living for those who dream about being here.
Well, you and I are perfectly in sync because this is exactly where I was going, my next question, and really leading into the conclusion of our conversation. Um, you use the term the long dark. I've heard you also use the term a rough initiation.
Yes.
And you've also said, you know, the question that I was wanting to ask you about this, about, and I have it right here in my notes, that may last decades, if not generations. And you just, right, you and I are in sync, just in terms of the flow of our conversation as well. And I've for most of my life I've been a fairly optimistic man. Maybe it's more of the heroic influence that you know that couched in optimism. But um, I would say probably for the first time in my life, I do at times feel deeply, deeply scared of what's coming. It's no longer kind of an abstract idea, climate change, um, particularly. I mean, I live in California too. I mean, there was a month out of last year when we couldn't really breathe the air here very safely because
Right.
of the fires.
Yes. Here
And
too.
and we're still pretty lucky. I mean, other places in the world, they're already losing their homes for climate reasons.
Right.
So, um, so as I, how, and I've heard you say something really beautiful about this as I reflect on, how to hold this. I heard you say there is no answer, but there is a response.
Yes.
Could,
Yeah. I
could you
was.
speak some more to that?
Yeah. I was speaking up in Victoria, Canada, about all of the things we're talking about to some degree, maybe not quite as deeply, but and then a very young woman raised her hand and says, "So what is the answer? How are we going to fix this?"
Mm,
I said, "There is no answer, but there is a response. And every one of us must decipher the response you are being asked to make and then to make it. Individually, I can't do a damn thing.
mm, mm-hmm,
Collectively,
mm,
we might have enough care and enough courage to respond boldly enough to preserve something in the dark. There's a term out of the Inuit culture called kartsaluni, and the word translates something like sitting alone together quietly in the dark, waiting expectantly for something to occur. That's where we are right now.
mm,
So we have to somehow let go of the fiction of fixing things, because I think that comes out of the same mindset that created the problem. We're going to have to go into dreaming, into the
mm,
imagination,
mm,
into the darkness, into the land below the land, into that underworld place and be dreamt into something. We can't figure our way out of this. It's going to require a completely different way of imagining what is happening for us right now. I often say this is a time of courage and faith. Courage to keep our hearts open, and faith that there's something intelligible about what is happening. Something intelligible. And if we listen, see, this is a time of humility, a time of deep listening, a time of not knowing. You know, we don't know what the hell's happening. We're watching
Mm,
what some people call the great unraveling.
mm,
Things are just falling apart, and they need to.
mhm.
They need to. Because what we've created is absolutely and utterly unsustainable for this planet.
Yeah.
So those structures have to fall apart. And that's scary because we rely upon those structures.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, we don't know what we're going to do without those structures. But this is where the return to living culture becomes so crucial. To gather in small circles of people, to sing again, to
Mm,
weep, to have rituals dreamt into our bones again that might suture the tear between our psyches and the soul of the world, so we can come back into some kind of reciprocal relationship with her in a way that does not cause permanent damage, but that we're actually beginning to put something back into her body,
mhm.
you know, and stop the great extraction.
Do you have hope for us, humanity, anyway?
It doesn't matter
Mm,
whether I have hope or not. It would not change my behavior.
mm, mm.
No,
Like that. Yeah.
you know, I don't know, but I have two grandchildren. You know, that brings tears. I have two grandchildren.
Mm,
What am I supposed to do? What if
mm,
I'm hopeless?
mm,
Does that mean I stop acting? Does that mean I stop talking and doing the things that I've been called to do?
mm.
Hell no.
Yeah.
I have to continue to do whatever I'm doing that I feel
Yeah.
called. My response, I have to have fidelity to my response. And I will do that until my last breath. And I don't know
Yeah.
when that's going to be. You
Yeah.
know, many, many fewer days ahead of me than behind me. That's for sure.
Yeah.
But I want them to be days that feed the body of the world. And hopefully, my grandchildren will have something that endures.
Yeah.
That's my act of love.
Last question. And I'm just so grateful for our conversation today. Um,
Me too, Brian.
for for our listener, and again, we have women and men listen to this, but I've my intention for this podcast is to speak to men specifically. So, what would you say? And you may have already said it, but I'd like to ask this question as a sort of a final question. What would you say is the biggest challenge facing a man today? And what one piece of wisdom might you offer in the face of it?
I mean, we've said it, I think, in many different ways, but the primary challenge is the fiction of separation, the idea of individual salvation,
Mm,
the idea of individual perfection, the idea of somehow um, the primary purpose of life is to fool the world into thinking you're
mm,
somehow special.
mm.
Uh, so, what advice I would just invite the men to become transparently vulnerable. You remember that feeling you had a little while ago when we talked about becoming an ordinary man
Mm-hmm.
and the relief that fell on
Mm-hmm.
your shoulders?
Mm-hmm.
I would pray for that for every man.
Mm-hmm.
Because then we can
Mm,
make this pivot away from
mm,
trying to impress to trying to participate. You know, there's a way in which we are so preoccupied by self obsession because we're so anxious about our place in the world. If we could grant that to each other. See, there's a real important piece here around we're always looking for belonging, right?
yeah.
We're always trying to find those little places of belonging. Well, at some point, at least by 40 or so, least by 47,
Mhm.
you need to stop looking for them and become one.
Mm.
You know, you need to
Mm.
become a house of belonging.
Yeah.
You see other people around you who feel lost and bewildered and
Mm.
disconnected and alienated,
Yeah.
and offer them a place of shelter.
Yeah.
Two things happens. One of them is that that person begins to feel at home in the world, and who knows what gifts they might be able to share then.
Yeah.
And you, by the very act of making a home, become a place where you know belonging.
Yeah.
So I would invite your listeners to do that as
Yeah.
well.
And I think that's a probably the core intention, even of my Elevate program. You know, I know we use that language, but you know, I don't promise men that they're going to make more money, that they're going to succeed in any different, you know, in any external way. I don't personally give a shit about any of those things. I think, and I don't know, maybe we haven't articulated it so much like this, but it's creating a house of belonging for men
Yeah,
in the individual heroic world. That to me has been the greatest gift of my to myself of regularly gathering with men in this way.
beautiful.
So I love that. Thank you for that, Francis. Where can our listeners, and I'm gonna just keep promoting the heck out of you and your work, and everything I can do to help people discover you, I'm gonna do. But where would you like our listeners to go to learn more about what you're up to right now?
The easiest thing is just francisweller.net. That's my primary website. And that's where you can find, we're not doing a lot right now, program
Hmm.
wise. Most of it's all online,
Hmm.
but there's a lot of resources in there for uh, programs that we have done that have been recorded that are available. And I mean, everything I'm doing, every piece that you've listened to around the recordings has one primary intention, which is to grow us up,
Mm.
you know, to get us outside of that adolescent obsession and begin to show up as robust adults in the world,
Mm.
so that the world might stand a
Mm.
chance. Yeah.
Well, I am all in, sir. I'm all in with you. I am all in for you and for us.
Yes.
Um, I am so profoundly grateful for this conversation, for you saying yes, for you offering your time and your insight and your presence and your wisdom and your graciousness. And thank you so much.
You're so welcome, Bryan. We might just have to do this again.
Will, yes, thank you, sir.